Today, I'm not going to deliver a paper, read from a paper, because I think it would probably take way over time and that would be inappropriate. So I'm instead just going to talk through some of the main features of my most recent work, which is a comparison of the philosophies of Friedrich Nietzsche and Zhuangzi, who is the second in the classical canon of Taoist thinking, so a Chinese thinker. We're moving further east as the afternoon goes on. So this is just a bit about the research area that I work in and the thinkers that I'm discussing today. I can just skip that. Okay, so the work I'm writing already exists in the context of scholarship that has appeared in recent years, over the past 20 years, drawing on the special kinds of affinities that can be found when reading Zhuangzi and when reading Nietzsche's works, which is quite strange given their disparate historical and cultural contexts, that they have so many similarities between them, and that's really the area that I'm focused on. So I argue in this paper that both thinkers are being misread in their respective traditions in very similar ways, and that's another point of interest for the comparison. And in this paper, I'm particularly focusing on the value of withdrawing from the social sphere, the value of solitude and the life of a hermit as a means towards philosophical realization. I think this sounds as though it's very much not about dialogue, but I think the implications of this way of reading these texts has quite a lot to offer in terms of thinking about modes and methods of dialogue. So the background of reception, this is very generalized, is that in both of their traditions, Nietzsche, I think especially in Europe, tends to have been thought of as an individualist. He's seen as being the arch-individualist, potentially by many scholars still to this day, as somebody who worships and celebrates the strong individual rising up over and above and against community, and against even religious reality. The same is true of the Zhuangzi, who in his own context is seen as being a critical counterpoint to Confucianism, to the communalist philosophy that's social interests in Confucianism. So in similar ways, they are both seen as heretical in their own contexts and as recommending that we depart from the norms of everyday social relationships and of the communities in which we live. So for that reason, they are thought of in this way very much as asocial thinkers who are interested primarily in aesthetic cultivation and in spiritual attainment that is personal, my spiritual attainment, the spiritual attainment of the individual. And this certainly has some foundations in their writings. I don't want to just disagree that this is completely wrong, because there certainly are elements of their writings that suggest this way of reading. I'm just going to give one example from Nietzsche, where he very romantically describes his own solitary task. He says, "Did I seek where the wind bites keenest, learn to live where no one lives, in the desert where only the polar bear lives, unlearn to pray and curse, unlearn man and God, become a ghost flitting across the glaciers." So clearly, for anyone that's read Nietzsche, Nietzsche sees a great deal of importance or value in retreating from, withdrawing from the community, which he refers to as the herd, specifically in terms of removing oneself from problematic and potentially degenerate forms of moral thinking. That's a fairly well-known story. And he then also, on this basis, frames solitude, especially in these kinds of romantic proclamations, as a test of strength, as a test of one's personal strength. So it's there in Nietzsche. Also in the Zhuangzi, we find a criticism that is mostly directed towards Confucianism of social existence, and particularly he thinks that political existence is profoundly dangerous and something to be avoided at all costs. This is to do with the historical period in which he lived, and it's quite correct to say that politics at the time in the warring states in China was very dangerous. But he's very perceptive about the specific kinds of dangers that emerge in political life. For Zhuangzi, acquiring wisdom is formulated in a personal sense, insofar as we have to transcend the sphere of social utility, but being made use of in social communities. So just like Nietzsche, there is a retreat from the communal sphere and a reverence for what it is to stand apart and to live apart and potentially even to live alone. So they both have very nice things to say about hermits. There are examples of this in the Zhuangzi, including the example of the useless tree, who is not cut down precisely because it's really knobbly and it's not really very good for building a boat, it's not good for making furniture, and for that reason, when the master axeman sees it, he just says, I'm not bothering with that tree, it won't be cut down. And that's the kind of tree Zhuangzi thinks that we ought to be, the kind of tree that won't be misused in the social domain. He also gives the example of disabled men who are not asked to go to war and to fight and to die, precisely because they have this disability, and receive various benefits from their disability, such as increased rations, and therefore flourish. Precisely in their incapacity, they flourish. There's also this praise of the ideal type of the mountain hermit, solitary person, wandering off and thinking about things in the mountains and being alone and apart and with nature. So for Zhuangzi, this method of withdrawal allows us to gain access to that thing which is probably central to all Taoist philosophy, namely the Tao. The Tao meaning the way of all things. It's sometimes been translated with the word God, although there's problems there with that translation, but some kind of ontological fundamental principle underlying all things that exist. And this is what the Taoist sage is really after, this access. So, they both express a reverence for life lived apart from the community, and the hermit is figured as an ideal type, and also see that capacity for solitary reflection is precisely what allows for us to gain this kind of insight, this kind of superhuman insight or transcendent insight into a realm above or beneath everyday life. So this is figured slightly differently in the two thinkers as written there. I'm going to go into that in detail. So solitude, my main claim here is that although for these reasons these philosophers have both been thought of as, to some extent, rabid individualists, and even in contemporary China, Zhuangzi is sometimes quoted as being a thinker through which we have the resources to think about the individual and independent from the political sphere in a very particular socio-historical context, in a way that perhaps isn't native to China. I still think that there is a more complicated story going on. It's not just let's retreat and leave and depart and never return to communal existence. So that's really the main argument of the paper that I wrote. That solitude in both their writings is a means and not an end of philosophical engagement, and this goes against the more heroic individualist readings that appear on both thinkers. And I think this relates in a crucial way to their notions of subjectivity and of self, and the ontologies of subjectivity that they both seem to share to some extent. And foundationally, that core element that guides this transition is that subjectivity, when one retreats into solitude and turns towards the self, to look into the self as opposed to being out amongst others, we find that the self itself is a very complicated place. For both Nietzsche and for Zhuangzi, the self is not one thing. It's made up of many competing, often uncomfortable things. It's the kind of community of dialogue that we're trying to figure out at the larger social level, but going on within one's soul, I suppose, would be the way to put it. So, and that inner multiplicity also is not something that begins with us. The thing that we are ourselves is not something that is causa sui. It does not start the minute we're born. It comes to us from a source outside of us, namely in Zhuangzi's context, the Tao, and in Nietzsche's context, he formulates this more in terms of psychosocial and historical forces into which we're born, into which we're always already emergent as individuals. So for that reason, there's a sense in which talking about solitude as an absolutely discrete moment of being apart from others makes no sense whatsoever. That one is never actually alone, even when one is on one's own. So yeah, I've just said that in this slide here as well. We see this represented through the various moments of confrontation and multiple inner dialogues with perspectives in both Nietzsche and Zhuangzi. I can't give all the wonderful examples there because of time. And particularly in their dialogical descriptions, in their attempt to entertain different perspectives, to think from different angles, and to reconcile themselves with themselves, in some sense. Yeah, I'll just skip that. Okay. So the other thing that both of them are also very keen to suggest, which is somehow eclipsed from this story of them as being individualists, is how much both philosophers are interested in communication, and how key that is, and how central it is to a number of their texts. Both of them, I think, formulate power, the kind of power that one can attain through engaging in solitary, whether it be meditation or other various practices, is a cultivation of a power that then allows us to go back out into the world and to be made stronger by that. Okay? So there's a sense that this moment of solitude is for the purpose of a return to the community. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche's thus spoke Zarathustra, we see this regularly appearing for those of you who've read the book. From the outset of the book, Zarathustra is compelled in various ways, again and again in the text, to go down to the people, to go down to communicate. And he tries in various ways to communicate with others. Often it goes horribly wrong, but he still continues to try doing this. And that sense that being enclosed within oneself as like some kind of a castle that is defending itself from the outside world is power. It's not the way that they see power. It's not the way that they see personal power. Zhuangzi also writes about the way that the sage, although he has kind of disconnected from political life and disconnected from social life, is able to go back into the social sphere in order to engage, but in a more dynamic way, based on the knowledge and wisdom that he's achieved in this solitary practice. So essentially what I'm arguing is just that, yes, solitude is crucial for both of them, but ultimately it's used as a tool in the attempt to find new ways of formulating relations with others and formulating relations with the community at large. So in conclusion, I'm just suggested, and I'm sad I wasn't able to argue through much of this, but I suggest that individualist readings miss the point on the subjective source of subjectivity, on the idea that what we are as people comes from something below us or beneath us, or even above us, depending on how we look at it. That they fail to reconcile the individualist and communicative features of their thinking. Any reading that reads these thinkers in one extreme as thinkers of individualism or thinkers of communalism is going to fail and flop, precisely because they're trying to find a middle way between these two extremes. And it also leads to straw men, basically it leads to a misconception of what they're trying to do, on the basis of which they've been criticised multiple times throughout history, particularly Nietzsche, by Heidegger, for example, as being rabidly ego-centred, which I don't think Nietzsche is. So then, yes, just to return to that main point, that solitude is used, and the value of the hermit's life is used by both of them as a means toward developing dynamic capacities in our relations with others, and a capacity for even for oscillating or vacillating between the outer and the inner world. And I think this serves as some relevance for the grounds of dialogue, insofar as this relates to the way that we as persons individually communicate with others, which may be a slightly more abstract formulation of the issue of dialogue, but nonetheless, it's definitely relevant.